From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
Welcome to the BG Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, an Associate Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. This is the third and final episode of a three-part series on Homelands and Histories, in which we talk to people making big impacts on local communities through their work on land use and cultural heritage. The word homeland can evoke comforting feelings of patriotism or cultural identity for some, but it can also be used to attempt to justify expulsion or even genocide. Similarly, the word histories is meant to call attention to the many points of conflict, debate, erasure, violence, and silencing that accompany efforts to describe and interpret the past. Today we are joined by Liz Harris, co-founder of the Glass City Goat Gals, and Sean Nestor, co-chair of the Lucas County Green Party. The Glass City Goat Gals is an agribusiness located in a densely urban area of Toledo. The Goat Gals have established a goat farm and community garden, and their mission is to provide affordable produce and education regarding wellness, healthy eating habits, and environmental sustainability. The Lucas County Green Party is lobbying for the city of Toledo and surrounding area to enact policies that support local urban agriculture, and Sean has personally advocated on behalf of community gardeners facing resistance from local government. Both of these activists are here to discuss how food access and land use figure into the history of our own homeland of Northwest Ohio. I'm very pleased to welcome Sean and Liz to BGSU. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
One of the things that we've been interested in is how different modes and methods of activism can address pressing social issues from a variety of angles. Can you introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in urban food activism in Northwest Ohio and how your current projects are supporting that work?
Okay, well, I got involved. I actually worked at Toledo Groves, but prior to Toledo Groves working there, I took the urban agriculture courses at Owens Community College, and really just saw a need in my community to create a healthier climate in my community. So took some courses, graduated, worked with Toledo Groves, and really got to get to know the community, got them out gardening, and just wanted to take a step further. And so right around where I live, there was a bunch of abandoned homes. We tore those homes down, started very small, few raised beds. I mean, the response from the community, you would see families coming with a little grocery bag, picking up some vegetables for dinner. And so we expanded that. I brought the goats in as a source of income to sustain the farm. And so we started there, and it grew, and it's so far so good. And now this is the fourth year of providing, we have a 4-H there for early childhood, and we also provide jobs for young adults during the summer. We have a summer teen employment program where they come learn soft job skills, get a little jingle in their pocket, but also contribute to their community, which goes a long way.
My involvement kind of stems back to 2013. I helped to start a garden in the Old West End of Toledo called the Collingwood Garden. And also that same year I ran for city council unsuccessfully. But one of the things that I did was part of my platform was trying to create some new urban agriculture laws. And even some of my friends were kind of like, oh, we don't really need those. Everything, there's nothing really specifically to address it, but there's also nothing specifically stopping it, so why fix something that's not broken? But a few years later, a guy by the name of Thomas Jackson started some very creative urban agriculture work in his neighborhood after acquiring vacant lots near his house. And he began attempting to remediate the soil by using wood chips instead of conventional compost, trying to cut down on the possibility of odor and offensive things. But some neighbors still complained, and it made its way up to a little bit on the city council and then eventually into the neighborhoods department. And he was fined $30,000 for having wood chips on his lot. And the actual citation was for having waste or refuse that he was not removing. So they were classifying these wood chips as garbage, essentially, and telling him he had to remove the garbage from his property. And they didn't quite get that he was trying to remediate the soil with something that is actually functionally urban agriculture. There was head scratching at why would anyone put these big piles of wood chips on their property. Well, anyways, as he was facing that, he was appointed to me by somebody in the urban agriculture community, and I met with him and talked, and I ended up becoming an advocate for him. And as the court case went on, and through all of its twists and turns, I would help publicize what was happening, and made sure that his side of the story got out at least a little bit. And around that time, a lot of people in the urban ag community who were rallying to support Thomas we're talking about how maybe it is time to be proactive. And hey, Sean, you were kind of talking about that before too anyway. So an ad hoc group of about a dozen people in the urban ag community from different gardens and entities we worked together to draft some urban ag policy, which is now evolving into something called the Urban Agriculture Alliance. So it's growing beyond those dozen folks, and it's becoming pretty much anybody involved with urban ag or community gardening in the Toledo area. Basically, our goal is to try to make sure that something like what happened to Thomas doesn't happen again, that we are able to provide some education to our policymakers as well as pushback, and also some guidance and advice on policies that they can enact. That's kind of how I got involved with all this. I've been the facilitator for the Urban Agriculture Alliance, helping it spin off and become its own thing, so I can step back a little bit, but that's kind of my story.
So, both of you have been involved in projects that start one way and then grow and develop in new directions. So could you talk about what you think are some of the strategies for being involved in a movement or beginning a business that develops and sort of survives past that, first year, first flush stage?
Right. Sean gave a good word for this. I'm going to let him introduce that new word or concept. But basically, being able to adjust to the adversities, having a clear-cut vision is one thing I always suggest, even if for the smallest garden. But when you want to do something to have an impact on the community, a clear-cut vision or mission statement is very necessary. And then also taking into account the cause and the effect. But I'm going to use your word, Sean. You have to have a rhizomatic approach to this. You explain to what rhizomatic is, because you have to have a rhizomatic approach, because sometimes the problem is material. Sometimes the problem is volunteer and just labor support. Sometimes, you just need water. And so you have to... I said this earlier, farming is something where you're constantly problem solving. And so that's one thing as urban farmers we have to do is problem solve on a day-to-day basis and adjust to what's needed and what's not needed, and make sure we're effective.
Right. So, yeah, I come kind of from an organizing background. I organize in a lot of capacities and in different ways. And one of the things, philosophically, when you talk with other organizers, people always go back and forth. And the conventional model is this more of a vertical organization where, there's some strong leadership that kind of sets the tone and everybody just follows that? Is it very horizontal where everyone's more or less treated equally? And there are pros and cons to both of those approaches. There's a term I heard somebody use once that I respect a lot, and it is rhizomatic. And it's based on the idea of a rhizome from a plant that, isn't necessarily going to grow up or to, sideways. It's going to grow based on where it needs to go in order to thrive, because plants are adaptive. They're some of the most adaptive things on the planet. And so to internalize that, I think what it really means, I think it's a good goal, because it means you're horizontal where you need to be, you're vertical where you need to be. But how do you determine that? Well, you do that by looking at the situation you're in and what makes the most sense at the time, and constantly reevaluating that, which takes some experience. It takes some, critical thinking skills. It takes
patience.
And it takes communication. It takes a lot, but when you can do it, it's beautiful. And I think that most of the movements that have really lasted have done so because they were elastic enough, they were responsive enough, they were adaptive enough, they were rhizomatic. And what we're trying to do with the Urban Agriculture Alliance is very much like that. We started small intentionally because we didn't want to take on too early this big organizing of everybody in the world, trying to get meetings scheduled with dozens of people's competing, availabilities. And also because at first there was a lot of interest in maybe bringing in some local politicians. In the first few meetings, there were a couple people who said, I'm good friends with so-and-so on city council. Maybe we should invite them to a meeting. And I had to kind of push back and say, I think that if we do that, it's going to end up becoming just automatically kind of a vertical thing, because there's a deference to authority that comes with a politician. And my experience, Politicians are glad to fulfill that role, but they're not always capable of following through with what they need because at the end of the day, they're the people who cast the votes. They're not really the people who write the laws. It's a common misconception. They usually have legal teams who work for the city to do that, or they have other resources. So I had to kind of implore people, hey, let's wait before we bring the city council people in, because if we trust our own experience in these early formative stages and we develop what we want, we can hand that over to a policymaker on a silver platter and say, go ahead and execute this for us. But we wrote the substance. You just take it to that last section on the finish line. And that works out a lot better in most situations with things like this, especially where there's possible contention between the city government that the council kind of inherently has to work with and people in the city who ultimately I think everybody is supposed to be accountable to. So we had that kind of rhizomatic experience of, do we imitate this conventional model because it sounds easy and it sounds kind of right, or do we kind of follow a different approach that really evaluates, is this appropriate at the time, and maybe let's do that later, but for right now, let's take this other path.
To piggyback on that, sometimes we adapt. Like, for example, we follow a lot of Cleveland's ordinances, and I've always said every city has its unique culture and climate that we have to adjust to. So that's why it's important that we have that real-time data from the actual growers in the community to adjust. We're not Cleveland. And so that's why it's very important that we modify those laws and those policies to what's needed in Toledo.
Right. Like early for people who don't know, Cleveland got some national recognition for passing some laws to essentially promote urban agriculture. And early on, the kind of ad hoc group of growers that I worked with to develop policy examined those as sort of a starting point because we knew it was good. But we also looked at it through the lens of, does this make sense for Toledo? And there's a lot of things that are really cool. Like they have like 3 different levels of green space that are base zoning. We're not sure if we even need one. We had these kind of debates because it just didn't make sense to us or something that was meeting a felt need at the time. We thought, we'll keep that in the back of our minds. So if later urban ag grows and develops and it has these new challenges, well, we can go back and revisit it. But for right now, we're just not there.
Right. Yeah, I got my shepherd's license from Cleveland. I was in Cleveland when I was just getting education and just gathering resources. I was up there all the time, and Chateau Huff is up there, and they have sheep grazing next to a hotel, and I have my shepherd's license, but I'm still waiting to use it, so we'll see.
So, what do you say to young people who are passionate about issues, whether it's the environment or food access, or something else entirely, but they feel like they don't know where to begin? What would your advice be for how to get involved and how to support their passion project or their social issue that interests them?
I personally think any youth, and when we're talking youth, I'm thinking of elementary education, high school. Start small. Start with your community, your school lunches. I mean, you don't have to change the world in one day. So really start small and see where you can make the difference, if that be a recycling program or just accessing fruit or making sure the school lunch is a little healthier or accessing more healthier foods at lunch. Start small, but really find that need. Whenever you find the need and you serve the need, you make a great difference in a community. So,
yeah. To reiterate some of that and to underscore it, my advice to people who are like, where do I start? I'd just say start anywhere and never be afraid of feeling like, oh, this is too small. Right. And I have, years ago, I went to the OSU for a conference called the National Student Power Convergence. It was a number of student activists from all over the country and some international. This is in the summer of 2012. And one of the coolest things I saw there was, at the time, I don't know if people know this, but in Quebec, the student unions there are actually organized as labor unions would be here, which means that when they threaten to raise tuition, the students go on strike. They stop going to class, and they will strike until they're like, no. And because of that, because they've had a culture of that for over half a century, their tuition rates for a public university are like the equivalent of $1,500 a semester, whereas most are $5,000 or $6,000. Right. So, and they got that because they're willing to strike. And I got to see a presentation from organizers from organizations called Classe. And it was one of the coolest presentations and the most inspiring because at that time, too, they were in the middle of what was ultimately a 9-month strike because the federal government was intervening and insisting that these students in Quebec start paying more. And the students went on strike. They had rallies, they were tear gassed, and these are students who are organized. And you have to remember, at a college or university, students are constantly graduating and moving on. So, there's a constant churn. And people asked, how do you keep organized for decades when every 4 or 5 years it's a totally new set of people? And what the woman said was, well, when I got involved, it was student lunches. They were going to raise the cost of the lunches in the cafeteria by 15 cents, and they had a big organizing campaign against it. And there were people who were always saying, like, oh, that's so petty. There's so many bigger problems in the world. You're stupid. Why are you wasting your time on such a small issue? And the counterpoint they always made was, look, if we never learn to organize and win on small issues, how can you ever ask us to go out and organize on these bigger issues? You're not letting people walk before they learn to run. And so that cynical attitude of, oh, that's too small, that's too petty, you have to push back against that. And if you're guilty of doing it, you got to stop having that mentality, because people need the ability to try and experiment with organizing that may be small, but it does get results. And when you get those wins, it really builds up. And, that's huge.
Yeah, and that's also a reason that Glass City Go Gals has a youth focus, because youth are the future. And like you said, that organizing is so good when you see a demonstration with the youth and community, because they're heard. A lot of demonstrations, at least you're seen and you're heard. So that was a good story.
Right.
Example.
And the one other thing I would mention that people always, it's not just that people think, oh, that's too small. When they were organizing to get their tuition to be $1,500, to retain a $1,500 roughly semester rate, students from other provinces were like, you guys pay way less than us. They were like jealous. Like, why are you so upset about paying, a few $100s more? You're still paying way less than us. And the response was, we pay less because we organize. And you guys could do it too if you stop sitting there and lecturing us. But I actually started doing what we do. And that really got me motivated to think, they're right.
Thinking.
Right.
It's got me thinking.
Liz, you're a BGSU grad, and you've lived in Northwest Ohio for a long time. What have you seen change about how people in local governments approach some of these land management and food access issues in that time?
I've actually seen them more visible in the community, I would say. I've seen Mike DeWine on my street. I mean, we've seen the mayor. I mean, they're actually more visible, but I wish they would be, what's the word I'm looking for? I wish they were where they were accessible on that grassroots. You see them the one time, and it's a media thing, and I definitely would like to see them more, and and not for my sake, because I really, like I said, I have a focus on youth engagement in the community, and I like them to know that their lawmakers and politicians care about their future as well. So that's one thing I've seen them, but accessibility is not as easy as just seeing them for that one day.
Right. I think that when it comes to changes in how land management has maybe focused over the last 10 years, following the 2008 economic crisis, there was a kind of a big boom in community gardens, but a lot of them followed this kind of nonprofit model where they would go for these big grants and pay staff people. They weren't volunteer driven. They weren't as grassroots. I mean, they'll say they're grassroots, but they were still dependent on these grants. And after a few years, when certain parts of the economy got better and certain parts didn't, the money just wasn't there. Our state government was not really eager to hand out money to people doing community gardens for whatever reason. So a lot of the nonprofit type land management and the nonprofit type of community gardening kind of went to the wayside. A lot of CDCs, for example, have since folded. CDCs that were doing incredible work, just they aren't funded, and so it's gone. And so there's that shift away from that. And I think what has been filling the gap somewhat, although not to the degree that the nonprofits could, has been more grassroots, just people in the community doing stuff. The other thing I've seen change is the attitude from local politicians, and some good and some bad. When I've talked to, so Toledo has all of this vacant land because it's a Rust Belt city with a declining population. And, I've talked to certain people on city council, and when I talk about, one of the smartest things we can do is repurpose this land for urban agriculture, a lot of people agree with that. But I've heard also, well, when we start getting more people, when the population starts reversing and growing, we want to be able to develop that land and sell houses. So there are people still really holding on to that because Toledo has shown some signs of recovery. And I think people are like getting like really eager, like, oh, we're going to be on this new path. And I'm skeptical about that. I think we need to assume a continuing decline in population and more ways of leveraging that land for agriculture purposes rather than trying to speculate on it and turn it into more houses.
Well, and that speaks to the need when starting a new initiative to really build that local community support, right? That, there may be a tendency to, go big, get the outside money, like bigger is better. But in fact, businesses or organizations that have the greatest influence are those that really are connected to the community and have a strong base of support. And you've talked, both of you, a lot about partnering with other organizations and other institutions, that kind of the collaborative approach to change. What do you see with, we've talked about some of the opportunities. What are some of the current obstacles to innovation in the region?
One, funding. Two, I believe amending the soil. In the urban setting, the soil, the lead content is a very serious issue, and it has had effect on youth in the past. And I think it's something that, one, we need to educate the community, because a lot of people got the garden bug, but they don't realize that growing in that soil, you want to be aware of what you're growing in and how you're growing in. We want to make sure that we're teaching our community how to grow healthy and also how to be aware of issues that they might come across growing.
Right. I think one of the obstacles I've run into is the policymakers, because many of them are not experts on urban agriculture. And while they might be really good with certain other aspects, more tangential matters, there's always this disconnect. So, for example, one of the big problems we have in Toledo is trying to build high tunnels, which are they're fairly simple structures. And if you want to do one legally, you have to pay like a $600 engineering fee and have an engineer stamp it like a PE. And that is at least twice as much as it usually costs for the actual materials to construct it. Right. And the difference is, like out in Cleveland, which follows the same building code, well, they don't have the same problem. I guess our local building department interprets some state law that's a little ambiguous differently, and they err on the side of being conservative and saying, well, just to be sure, we want you to actually have to get an engineer, which is really not affordable or really economical. Right. So it's just kind of helping. We need to find a way to get that to change, to get them to understand it doesn't make sense to request an engineering drawing for something that doesn't even have a foundation. It's just something you stick in the ground and have a cover over. But those kind of gaps where everything looks good until, well, the rubber hits the road. The biggest thing with the Plan Commission right now that we're going head-to-head with is the Plan Commission in Toledo is really against the idea of being able to put up a table on residential property and sell vegetables that you grow on vacant land there. They're like, oh, this is going to bring all this traffic into the neighborhood. They're treating it as a commercial enterprise, which to them may as well be a corner store. But urban agriculture is unique. It may technically kind of be a commercial enterprise, but it's very much not like a corner store, and you're not going to have those same problems. So helping them, understand that this is unique, it does warrant special attention. It shouldn't be lumped in with all these other types of activity. That's what we're really trying to do, is get them to adapt, and we're doing that collectively as a group to make sure they understand that the urban ag community, which has a lot of support in Toledo, really demands this change, and we demand that they work with us to find a solution.
Yeah, I think the policies should be incentives as of now. The communities are just land sitting there. And so I hope the policies encourage people to go out and put a market stand up in their community, because it's necessary, it's needed. And one, just in my experience with the neighbors, being able to see how I grow the food, they see when I use the compost, when I apply it, they see that, and now they understand, and they know where their food comes from, which creates more dialogue as to what is access to healthy food. In my neighborhood, we have no restaurants. We have one supermarket, I think two in about a 5-mile radius, but people don't have transportation, and all this stuff it needs to be addressed as far as how is it affecting the health in our community, how is it affecting, even with the vacant lands, you don't want people to come in and start squatting on land and these becoming trash receptacles for, littering and things. So I think we should be very proactive in the policies to help the growers.
Well, what you're talking about is how these systems are so deeply enmeshed in other systems, right? That food is not separable from health and community wellness and socioeconomic concerns and all of these things. And too often, it seems like the policies that exist deal with these things in isolation. And so part of the projects you both are involved in is a more holistic approach to how you're transforming whole communities, and sustainable practices are one piece of that, but it ripples outward from there.
So think about it. Most of us growers are all in different parts of the Toledo. Like, we are kind of equally spaced out. And I'm in the Cherry Street area. I know we have University Church. We have Toledo Groves. We have Collingwood. What's it called? The Forest Garden. I love that garden, yeah. And so we're all over the place, but each one is so significant where they're orientated. I also work a lot with the Greenbelt Apartments. Started a gardening club there, and believe it or not, I can't be more these gardeners 2 years ago. Because, like I said, when you get people to garden, have to have authentic relationships, are still gardening. We planted trees over there. We planted fruit trees over there, and to this day, families are still affected by that, those things that are going in there.
We've been talking about a lot of the local context, but you've mentioned Cleveland and some other areas. What other organizations or programs or initiative are you aware of elsewhere in the country that you see as models of providing good ideas that could be adapted, that you'd like to see worked on for our community?
Ridall, they're doing a aquaponics demonstration here in May 19th, Wayman Palmer. Also, Ridall Chateau Huff, I got to meet him. He was featured. He used an abandoned acre to create a wine. He grows grapes, creates wines. His wife is from Toledo. Just a lot of models that I think all of them are not necessarily good for or can be applied to Toledo, but most of them can be applied, and these are small. They could be micro enterprises that I think would really benefit our Toledo style. We're just a cool city with great restaurants, great eateries. Downtown is vastly changing and taking on a new identity. So I think everything is on time,
Policy-wise, I think Cleveland is a good basis for a model, although it shouldn't be copied exactly. Trying to be rhizomatic, you have to understand certain things of it are going to work well in Toledo and certain things might not. But, as far as some of the practical land use, I think one of the cooler things would be, I think it's in Portland, maybe Seattle. They've done food forests where and that's what the Collingwood Garden wants to eventually do, using permaculture practices, which largely become kind of self-sustaining. They want to develop fruit trees and kind of plant in such a way that they strategically support each other. So even without human beings to go in and weed or do things, it kind of just sustains itself, and also provides food that anybody can just go and take and eat, and it's healthy and it's free, and that's something that we could do as a public use kind of thing. We're used to parks that have ornamental or decorative plants, but why don't we have parks where you can go and just eat some of the food right off the tree? So that's something that a food forest can kind of do that I think would be really cool to do in Toledo.
Could you talk a bit about your educational background and how the skills or approaches that you learned in school have shaped the way you approach problem solving today?
Sure. So my background's in engineering, and actually for my day job I work as a network engineer. And engineering really teaches you to look at systems of complex machinery that all work together to create an end product. And when things aren't working on a systemic level, it teaches you to kind of look, okay, this does this, which goes here and does this thing, and if you're getting this outcome, it's probably because this piece isn't working right. So it kind of teaches you to look at the whole picture, the holistic view, if you will, but also to be able to narrow down and say, this might be a bottleneck or this might be a problem, and let's work on this guy here. And I've used that a lot to examine what the current obstacles are, and I try to apply that in my kind of rhizomatic organizing approach, because I think it's difficult to know where to adapt unless you have the analysis ability to say, well, the system's supposed to work like this, and if we tweak it here, it'll work a little bit better for this specific outcome or that outcome. And that's kind of just how I approach it.
My educational experience is a little different. I have played basketball, All-American basketball, all the way to the collegiate level, and so team team effort is what I do. I look at everything from a team aspect. And so when you take that into the community, you learn how to rally the troops in the community and really leverage support. So I think that's one thing that I've taken from my education. Another is I am a part of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and we are built on sisterhood, scholarship, and service being the most important part of that. It's like the grease to the wheel of a community, volunteerism, and just getting people to give back without always looking for a paycheck. I think so many times people tell a kid to go fill out an application, but it's become so impersonal now that volunteerism is one way that you can see is, do I like this field, or do I like what I'm doing? Is there passion there? If not, go somewhere else. If so, then you found your niche, So I think that's service is what I do as well, and that's one thing that I've taken from my education.
We've talked a bit about young people and students and getting involved. And what would be your piece of advice for anyone in the community as a way to first get started in better understanding maybe food issues and becoming part of the solution?
What's really caught on in my neighborhood is actually growing vegetables in their flowers and in their landscaping, and teaching them my neighbors. It's really, they're addicted to growing vegetables now. It's so funny. My cousin, he's like, I can't stop planting seeds. I got peppers in my front yard, but they're just so amazed by the yields, what they get. And then I just see people like Toledo Grows gives away growing books. They're just fascinated by growing. But you also see with the father, he's teaching his son, and his son is teaching his friends. And so it's kind of a chain effect of how people are learning how to live healthier just by one simple garden.
Well, there's certainly a way in which our modern lives divorces us from those processes, right? Like where does food comes from? The grocery store, right? Like you ask a kid, where do you get your food? And they're likely to say the grocery store, not
tomato trees.
Right. Where does it come from? Does
Right.
it, what grows on a tree? What grows out of the ground? So certainly becoming more aware of how these processes work. You also had both talked before about the importance of volunteering. Could you say more about some of those ways of getting involved?
Well, never be afraid to go out and ask any nonprofit organization for assistance, especially when there's youth. I have this belief that youth should be included in every aspect of their community, one cleaning, one improving policies and lawmaking. They should be. So you'd be surprised if you reached out to your local Boys and Girls Club, your local YMCA, your local Girl Scouts, how much support you would get from those organizations to assist you with those community-driven ideas.
I think you just find an organization that's doing something you're interested in, and you show up. I can't stress enough. It sounds so simple and so mundane, but really just showing up and listening and, always listen at first and find an opportunity. And, hey, I might be able to help with that, even if it's something like just, setting up the chairs after an
Right.
event, things like that. And before you know it, people come to know you. They think of you when there's opportunities. That's the rhizomatic way, I think, is just showing up, listening, and responding when an opportunity presents itself that fits. And it takes time, and I think that's something that a lot of kind of our current culture, really just the dominant culture in America, is very like, if it's not happening right now, I'm done. You got to be willing, just like with growing, you got to be willing to be patient and give it time to grow, to develop, not rush it or get mad at it because it takes its time. And if you are willing to give that patience, you're going to see the outcome, and it's going to be beautiful.
Right. I'm so proud to say, since the Goat Gals, since we started, crime has been reduced by 50%. In fact, it's reduced so much that I can't get a camera that I want. So, I mean, you may not see the improvement one way, but there's other aspects: the reduction of crime, the reduction of litter, youth truancy. I mean, all these things are affected by just being a healthy community. So look at the effects of it in more than just fruit and healthy. It's health, it's safety, it's community, it's neighborhood. It's all of that.
Any last words or any other pieces of advice you'd like to share?
I just want to thank you for having me out here today, because anytime I have a chance to speak on stewardship, which is just taking leadership in your community or over your land, it's just important to me to explain to others that you should do the same as well. In your neighborhood, whether you are in an apartment or whether you're in a multifamily home, you can always take leadership in your space, so do so.
I would get a little more specific and just urge anybody interested in urban agriculture specifically to look up the group Toledo Urban Ag on Facebook and join it. And if they happen to hear it before this event, we're going to be meeting on Friday, March 9th at 6:30 p.m. at the Seagate Food Bank. That's the Urban Agriculture Alliance that's formed. We highly encourage anybody, and you don't have to be in Toledo for it. If you're just in the region and interested, we'd love to have you out there and be part of our group. So hopefully that'll get some more people out.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking with you both. Our producer today is Chris Cavera. Special thanks to our co-sponsors for this event, the College of Health and Human Services, the Stoddard and O'Neill Fund in the School of Cultural and Critical Studies, and the Center for Community and Civic Engagement. We'd also like to thank the Office of Campus Sustainability for their work as well. Thank you very much.